Today we are looking at mark making, how mark making affects value, how when individual marks are clustered together that they can create a range of values. Obviously, as they're closer together, they're darker. As they're further apart, they're lighter. And I wanted to review the vocabulary that we had in our value unit earlier. Stippling, using a series of dots as a means to shade and to show value. Hatching, to mark or shade with one or more sets of non-intersecting parallel lines. An accumulation of these lines, when built up, create a range of value. Scribble is to add marks in a random scribble pattern to create value. The more mark overlap, the darker the value. We can see that here, that the more overlap there is in the shadow as well. Cross-hatching, intersecting parallel lines that are used at varying distances from one another to create a greater range of values, gray and black. We can see as they're further apart, they create less value. Where the light source is hitting, there's barely any value. And they're more clustered together where they're darker, and obviously the darkest where they're clustered together at the shadow. Contour hatching, to mark or shade with curved hatching or cross-hatching marks to follow the shape of form. These curved contour hatching marks emphasize modeling and value. And we can again see the curve is physically describing the shape of the form. And that's what's most important about contour hatching. And we can also see that a little bit in scribbling, showing modeling the shape of the form. Modeling, to capture the three-dimensional quality and shape of forms through drawing, e.g. shading, hatching, or stippling. So any of these methods can show modeling. I believe that scribbling and contour are closer to showing modeling, but obviously any of these methods, cross-hatching, stippling, hatching, can also show modeling. I wanted to particularly look at this value scale at the bottom, and we can see the different versions of it, with the left one being hatching, the middle one being cross-hatching, and the right one being stippling. We can see as these marks get closer together that we can see that they are darker, just like we can see rendered on the value scale. And likewise, the darker the values, they are clustered together. We see that over here on the ball, and they are further apart as the values get lighter. We're looking at Albert Durer's Night, Death, and the Devil. It's an engraving done in 1513. This whole work was made with cross-hatching and contour hatching. It's made with a specific process called engraving, and this is where an artist would incise lines in a copper plate, and they would stick ink into these incised lines and transfer it to paper. So Durer was actually working in reverse. When we look at this close-up of Night, Death, and the Devil, we can see the direction of the marks and how the directions inform the modeling, the shape of the form. For example, in the helmet, we can see how the curves of the marks actually are showing the shape of the form. Likewise, in the knight's armor, right here and right here. And as they're darker, we see shadows. Where it's lighter, we see highlights, making this armor look shiny. And when we look at the horse, we can see the muscles of the horse. And as these marks get closer together, we again see shadows. We also see texture, where the marks are varied and show the shape of the hair. In this other detail, we can see the variations in textures. We see how these curve-like shapes at the bottom show the rock-like texture of the surface that the horse and the dog are walking on. And it also shows how different marks give different tactile qualities. For example, if we look at the hair again on the dog and how these lines are clustered together in a specific way, they create the flow and the actual shape of the form. Next, we're looking at Albert Durer's Praying Hands, a very iconic piece. And this work was specifically done on a ground. The paper is actually a toned paper, and Durer added dark ink to show the dark marks and left the ground to leave the medium values. And as these marks get further apart, we see the intermediary values. He also used white watercolor to add highlights to his praying hands. On the right, we see Hendrik Goltzius, circa 1600. He was born with a birth defect, as we can see on his hands, but we can see he's emphasizing more of the muscle and the textures on the hand, the knobbiness of the knuckles. And we can see that the light source is coming from the top here, and that all these shadows are created to give this hand volume. On the left, we're looking at a Goltzius, 1587. It's an ink drawing. The wonderful thing about this piece is it really gives us a closer up look of his markmaking, how these rigid circular lines create this very voluminous form, very curved and round. On the right there, we see Rembrandt, 1630. It's an etching. And etching is a printmaking process that gives us a little bit more of freedom and looseness, closer to drawing or ink drawing. And in this particular piece, we see a great deal of cross-hatching, but with the cross-hatching, we also see scribbly marks that kind of give us the illusion that this hair is flowing or moving. But again, we see the darker marks where we see shadows, and the lighter marks where we might see light hitting, for example, on the cheekbones, on the nose. We're looking at Kath Kollwitz. She's a German expressionist. These prints were done around 1920. A lot of her self-portraits were somber depictions of herself, mostly done around or after World War I. She lost her son during the war, so we often see these very dramatic self-portraits. We see the visceral quality of her lines, how the mark-making is erratic and free to show the very much expressive form. Now we see that the lines are physically darker around the face here to show the darker values. The lines are physically more voluminous and fat to show darker areas. And we see lighter lines where we see lighter values. So she's very much using weight of line to implicate value here. Now this is a woodcut, and she's working in reverse, so she's cutting away the light areas. And we can see, again, she's using this very erratic mark making, which very much alludes to the expressiveness of these somber portraits. But again, working in reverse, she's adding highlights, and we see as the marks are lighter, they're more medium values, and where they're further apart, it gives us less or more value depending on the process. We're looking at Ethan Murrow. He's a professor of drawing and painting at the School Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He was also my studio mate in graduate school. His work is often these post-apocalyptic visions, very much surrealistic, often landscapes. He often uses mark making and cross-hatching. In graduate school, he's very influenced by Ansel and Kiefer, where we would see these expansive landscapes, but very gritty and textured. And as he got into his own work, he started collaging these self-portraits of himself. He would take photos in a studio, and he'd collage them in Photoshop and create these unusual scenarios. But we can see the lightness of his marks in the back here, and how the cross-hatching is very light to create the lighter values, and that he's using the physicality of the graphite in this work to show the darkness of the value, and as they get closer together and darker in value, the values get darker. Now his earlier works use pencil, and his newer works are using Sharpie. He does a lot of installations. This was an installation done at Mass MoCA. Because he uses his hand so much, he has a hand brace, but we can see the extensive amount of mark making and value and textures that he's putting together by overlapping these individual lines. He often does oversized drawings. In this drawing, we see the elephant in the water, very still. These people are going to come in the water and rescue this elephant. Again, these kind of post-apocalyptic narratives, very surrealistic, with gadgets and all types of odd things that he creates. And he literally creates these gadgets almost like sculptures and takes photographs, and then he works from the photographs. The wonderful things about these is not just the subject matter, but I think also the way he makes these works of art. We can look at this, the mark making is just exquisite. We see the expressive marks of the ball, we see the shadows on this side, we see the light source coming from this side, we see the shadows on the back, the light source coming to the knuckles. Very wonderful piece. But we very much can see that the density of value that we're looking at here really can represent how dark a value can be or how light a value can be. And that's very clear here with the picture of the clouds. We see that as the lines are darker and more clustered together, we have a darker smoke cloud. And then on the right, we have a lighter smoke cloud as the lines get lighter and further apart. And the further they get apart, the lighter these areas get. And the closer they get together, the darker they get. And the more clustered together they are, the darker they get. The wonderful thing he's able to do with these is he's able to not only convey emotion, but he's also able to convey texture. We see the texture in the grass at the bottom here as well. This is two portraits by Vince Lowe. Obviously, we're looking at Jim Carrey on the left and Jack Nicholson on the right. The wonderful thing about his work is the freeness of these pen drawings. These are actually ink and pen drawings. You can actually see the splatters on Jack Nicholson over here on the right, and the splatters down here on his chin. The wonderful thing about his work is it's very free-flowing. It's almost like he doesn't pick up his pen as he's working. There are values made with scribbles. So most of the stuff we've been looking at is hatching. We saw a few scribbles in the Rembrandt, but this one is completely scribbles and not contrived in any way, very free-flowing, very expansive. But we can also see that he's getting contrived in areas to show these details, to make these characters look like who they are, the portraits that we're seeing. I think it's just a very wonderful way of rendering these portraits. We're also seeing him following the form. We can see that these marks, the scribbles, follow the form to give direction and modeling. This is a student example from a student from a few years back. This student decided to work in scribbles, and we can see the scribble marks as the way of using mark making. And as these scribbles get closer together, we see that they get darker. As they get further apart and lighter, we see less value. So very much a good description of what we will be doing in our upcoming project. This student also decided to use scribble as a form of modeling or mark making, and we can see that this student decided to work with a much more vigorous approach of making marks. We also see some directional mark making. For example, on the shadow here, we see the shadow following the direction of the arm's form. Likewise, we see it on the neck muscle. And then on the background, we see that the background is very flat. Notice that where the areas are physically darker over here, the marks are closer together and the marks are fatter and the graphite darker when applied. Then over here, they're very much lighter and further apart. So figuring out that balance between lights and darks.